Hey everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you how I created this praised jasper and clear quartz wire wrapped pendant using silver plated copper wire. All you'll be needing for this tutorial is a pair of wire snips and a pair of round nose pliers. I like to keep my tools very simple and minimal. You can use more pliers if you feel like you need them. And we'll be wrapping this beautiful piece of praised jasper. Jasper has a really stabilizing and grounding energy, so I really enjoyed working with this stone. We'll be starting off with some 0.4mm weaving wire, which we are going to be using to weave together our 1mm base wire. To begin weaving with this weaving wire, I am going to anchor it onto the base wire, so I hold it with my thumb and forefinger whilst I coil it around the base wire several times. Typically I do this between 4 and 10 times depending on the size of the piece. And one more for luck, and pull it really nice and tight and make sure to bunch the coils together really firmly and tightly with your fingers, and then I move the coil down to about 1/3 of the way along the base wire. Then I'll add in the second piece of 1mm base wire, making sure it's even in length. And then I pull over that weaving wire over the top of that new piece of base wire, acting as a coil just like we did with the original base wire, but this time around too. And then I'll add the third piece of base wire, again checking to make sure that they're the same length at the ends. Now we're going to bring that weaving wire back up through that bottom and middle wire and over the top and middle wire, making sure to push the weave nice and tight together and keeping those wires nice and parallel to each other. And we're going to just splay out these base wires to make sure that there's a nice gap between each one to make the weaving process easier. Now we'll pull that weaving wire up from behind that bottom wire and then over those bottom two base wires. And now that we've finished that first part of the pattern, we're going to start coiling the weaving wire around that bottom wire, maybe 3 or 4 times. I think I'm going to go in for a 4th coil there, just because then it creates a nice amount of space between each of these little zigzag patterns. Now that I've done those 4 coils, I'm going to start that pattern again, so I'm going to bring the weaving wire up and over those bottom 2 base wires, and then up between the middle and bottom wire over the top 2 wires, and then back up and around over the bottom and middle wire. And now you can see that there's a pattern starting to form, so hopefully you're getting a hang of this. I would suggest pausing the video and replaying a section if you're struggling to understand it, or if you just need to go over the same part a few times. And now I'm coiling the wire 4 times around that bottom base wire, and so on and so forth. This is quite a simple basic weaving pattern which I use for quite a lot of my pieces, and it should be fairly simple to follow. For the overall design of this pendant, you don't have to use this weaving pattern. It's just a simple and effective one that I like to use. So please feel free to experiment with different weaving styles and different patterns. There's quite a few different things you can do with 3 base wires, so just have fun and play around and see what patterns you can come up with. After you've continued with that pattern for a while, this is what your weave should be looking like. At this point, I feel that I have a long enough weave to wrap around the stone and to create the central frame for the piece. I can usually just eyeball this nowadays, and I can tell that I've got enough to wrap around the stone. However, you can use a piece of scrap wire to wrap around the stone to make sure that your weave is long enough to use as a frame. To bend this round, I'm going to just pinch that central part of the weave and pull the sides together to create a gentle bend in the frame. It's always important to be firm but slow with the bending of the wire so that you don't make any mistakes, as it can be quite difficult to undo unwanted bends in the wire. So I've noticed that I've actually weaved the weave slightly too long, so I'm actually going to undo some of the weave at the top here. You can just snip the excess weave off, but I'm wanting to save some of this weaving wire, so I'm just going to carefully unweave it from my base wires. It's important, if you do end up having to do this, to not pull and tug the wire too much, because once it's been bent as much as it has, as you can see, it's kind of crinkled. If you're too tough with it at this point, it can lead to breakage, so be careful. I'm also more confident doing it with this wire because it's silver plated wire, so it's a lot stronger than bare copper wire. And now I'm just going to shape the weave into the frame shape that I want. I want it to fit the stone, to be the same shape and slightly smaller in size, so it actually covers the front edges of the stone. Now that I'm happy with the shape and size of the frame, I'm pinching the end of the weave and pulling the ends of those base wires down. And on this side, I am actually just going to go ahead and snip a bit off, because there's no point saving that bit of wire, and sometimes you can just literally slide that weave off the end, which makes it a lot easier. So now that I've done the same thing on the other side and I've bent the ends of those base wires outwards, I'm going to sort of splay the base wires up and out to start preparing for weaving the bail. I'm finally happy with the shape of all of these wires, so we're going to go ahead and start weaving a bit of this bail. I start this by splaying out the wires a bit so there's lots of space to weave between, and then we're going to do the same thing we did at the beginning, where I anchor this wire onto the base wire by coiling over just once here, and then I'm basically doing the same weave again, where I'm going once over those bottom two wires, and then once over the top two, and then once over the bottom two again. But the difference here is that I'm going to actually continue this pattern over to the other side. So I'm joining all these ends together, and I'm going to be weaving two at a time. So I'm bringing this weaving wire up and through that fourth wire and the third wire. Sometimes the weave will move up and down the wire like I just did then. You just have to hold it in place with your other hand as you continue weaving. And after you finish the weave, it won't be moving around, so don't worry about it. And then I'm continuing to weave two wires at a time, up between the bottom wire and over again. Always remembering when we're weaving to push the wires tight together and to be quite firm when we're pulling the weaving wire, so that it's nice and tight but not too firm, so that we don't bend and misshape the base wires. We're not going to weave the whole bail here, we're just going to do once back and forth to secure these wires together, as we are now going to move on to creating the outside frame. To begin making the outside frame, take your piece of 1.6mm wire and create a bend right in the middle. We want this perfectly bent in half, so if you'd rather use a measuring tape, that also works. I like to just eyeball it, and then once you've found that central part of the wire, you come in with your bent nose pliers and push that very middle bit against the pliers, as I'm doing here, as this creates a nice sharp 90-degree bend in the wire. And then doing the same on the other side to create that really nice bend, a nice triangular shape. I actually decided that I wanted a slightly different shape for this outside frame, so we're actually going to make this bend really close and as tight as possible, and I'm just gonna even out these bends in the wire up here. And once the space at the bottom of that little point is nice and close together, you can pull it together like this, just pinching it together so that the wires couldn't be closer together. And then I'm holding that sort of point with the pliers and opening up the wires to create this very nice sharp point shape. Now that we have this lovely little point in our frame, we're going to start shaping this outside frame, and we want it to be quite a similar shape to the inside frame that we've just weaved, but we want it to be slightly larger. And here I'm just using my fingers to keep this nice and symmetrical and shape it into the sort of teardrop shape that I love to use in my designs. And I'm just checking in with the inside frame to make sure that I'm leaving enough space, because if these two frames don't have enough space between them, it can be quite tricky later on. I'm pretty happy with the shape I have here, and there seems to be enough space between the two frames. So now I'm going to move forward and bend these ends up and out so that they're the same as the inside frame that we've just made. These ends are now going to be used in the bail, and we'll be weaving all of these ends together. I'm just adjusting the angle of these ends using the bent nose pliers. I didn't quite get the right angle I wanted with my hands, but maybe you will. Now that we've got everything nice and lined up, we're going to start weaving the bail. And don't worry if these two frames move around a lot, we can adjust everything as we go. So we're going to once again splay out the ends of these base wires. We want to make the weaving process as easy and quick as possible, as it's the most time-consuming process. And especially when we're weaving together several pieces of wire, it can sometimes become a bit confusing. So making sure that there is a fair amount of space between each wire will make the weaving process a lot easier. So I'm going to begin by weaving twice over these bottom two wires. I do this because this outside wire is quite thick, and it just looks better with this thin 0.4mm wire to weave over it twice. It creates a better contrast. So we're doing the same pattern that we started to do earlier on for the beginning of the bail on the inside frame, where we're weaving two wires at a time, and the two wires that we weave will always include the one closest to us that we've just woven before. I think it's easier to understand this with your eyes than me trying to explain it with words. It's a very simple weaving pattern and it creates a very solid, reliable bale if we do this for the whole bale. And just again at the end here, I'm weaving twice over these outside 2 wires since that outside wire is so thick. I find that since I'm using 0.4mm wire, if I just weave once over that thick wire, it doesn't look so good. And this is what you should have once you've continued that pattern on for a while. I wish I timed myself so I could tell you how long this took me, but I have no idea. Now that we're satisfied with the length of our weave for our bale, I'm gonna come in with the snips and just snip off that little bit of wire that we used to originally anchor on the wire for this weave. And to finish the weave, I like to just coil it off over one of those wires. I usually choose the second one from the outside to coil around maybe 3 times, as this anchors on the weaving wire and prevents the weave from moving around anymore. And you should have something like this once you've coiled it around a couple times, and then we're just gonna snip it off, always remembering to snip off on the side that's going to be inside the bale once we bent it, so that just in case there is a little scratchy piece of wire, it isn't touching anything on the outside. And then you can get a tool that does this for you, but like I said at the beginning of this video, I like to have very minimal tools, so I'm just bending the bale over my pliers. You can also use pens and pencils or kind of anything you have lying around that is cylindrical. These wires are now going to act as the backing for the pendant so that the stone doesn't fall out of the back, and we're just going to separate them so that there's a good amount of space between each wire and we can work with them easily and see them clearly so that they don't get confused with each other. And you can see here that they want to be symmetrical, and those second and third and fifth and sixth wires are not the same length, making it asymmetrical. So I'm just going to snip them to the same length, and the same for those 2 middle wires right in the middle there. It just makes it easier to see how much wire you have to work with when they're all at about the same kind of length. I like to do these wires from the middle to the outside, so I'll typically finish off these central 2 wires to begin with, and I often do this in the same way for a lot of my pendants, which is having them on either side of this bottom point and bringing them up and over so that they anchor on to that bottom central bit of the outside frame, just like so. And this will be the central sort of backing part of the frame that will keep the stone in place. Make sure to pull these wires nice and tight so they are really well anchored onto that outside frame. This part is important so that there isn't any wiggle room for the wires to move around or come loose, as these are going to be really important in keeping the stone in place. And at this point, often I can actually slide the stone in and see how it fits in the frame overall, since these 2 middle wires are in place to stop it falling out of the back in the middle. And then I'm going to go ahead and continue anchoring on the ends of these wires, and I'm going to do something very similar with the next 2 middle wires that I've done with those 2 original ones, and that is bringing it up and over and then under the back of the frame, so it creates this kind of elegant sweeping motion and shape that I really enjoy to use in a lot of my designs. And then we're going to go ahead and finish off those last of the thinner wires, and these ones I'm going to curl inside the inner frame. This positioning helps to create less space between the stone and that inner frame, and it creates this pressure that really helps to hold the stone in place inside of that central frame. And then I'm going to bring these wires around the back, making sure that they come out between the same wires at the back there. And I'm going to pretty much bend them round the outer frame in a similar way that I have done with the other wires. This whole part of decorating the pendant with these ends of the wires is my favourite part of the whole process, as it's so flowy and intuitive. We're now gonna finish the design with these outside wires that we use for the outside frame. Since they're so thick, they create quite a dominant aspect of the design of the pendant. So being quite intentional with where we place these wires is important, as they can really change the whole vibe of the design. I am going to follow the same sort of flow as I've created with the other wires that we finished off with here, and just gently but firmly creating these soft curves in the wire with my fingers, remembering that this thickness of wire, if you bend it in a place that you wouldn't like it to be bent, it can be quite difficult to sort of get it to move back to how you'd like it to be, especially with a small kind of more detailed design like this. And you can just carefully adjust any kinks or areas where the wire is sort of moving in a direction you don't like it to with the pliers, but this might be something that you get more comfortable with as you've been working with wire for a longer time. And here I'm just going in and really making sure that the ends of those wires are really anchored in there and they're really firm and they're not gonna come off. And I'm actually even going to double wrap a couple of these to really make sure that they're properly secured onto the frame. Then when I'm happy that the wires are very well secured onto the outside frame, I'm going to just go in with my snips, and as close as possible to the frame I'm going to snip the wires so that it's nice and clean and flat. And you can of course file the wires down later with a metal file if there's any bits sticking out, any sharp bits. We're now going to bend these thick wires up round the back of the pendant like so, making sure to hold on to the curves in front quite tightly so that they don't move around as you bend the wire up the back of the frame. I'm now going to snip these wires a bit shorter, as all I'm going to do next is curl them around into the frame to finish them off and secure them, so I don't need them to be this long. Now I'm going to take my trusty round nose pliers and use them to bend the ends of these big chunky wires into place, into the frame. There's no correct way to do this as long as the wires are secured and you've bent them in and really tucked them in tightly so that they don't move around. Here I'm kind of curling them around to the side and actually over some of those other back wires. Again, there's no correct way to do this as long as they're tucked away and secure and it works as part of the design. Now I'm going to add a bead to the front of the design. This is a clear quartz bead and I'm taking a long piece of 0.5mm wire. It really doesn't need to be as long as this, but I enjoy having more than enough as I find it a little bit easier to work with. I'm going to loop this back over and through the bead because this kind of secures it onto the wire and stops it from moving around so much and is just a bit more secure to work with. So we're going to thread the end of this weaving wire through that gap in that thick wire so that the bead is positioned in the middle of that gap at the bottom of the pendant design, and then we're going to thread the other end of the weaving wire through the same part on the other side. And then we're basically going to coil this weaving wire around this thicker wire maybe 4 times. So we're going to tighten it here, make sure that this is really nice and tight, as this will help keep those 2 pieces of thick wire together and secured onto the frame, as well as making sure this bead is really nicely secured. So we're just going to loop this weaving wire down and through, coiling onto this thick wire a few times. And doing the same on the other side, making sure that the bead is staying nice and central and that we're not pulling it too far either direction, and just really firmly securing this 0.5mm wire to those thick pieces of wire. And then once that is nice and secured, you can just go ahead and snip that weaving wire nice and close so that there aren't any scratchy bits. And that is basically the whole design. The bead does spin around a little bit, but I don't mind that so much. And there's not a lot that you can do to avoid that. And it doesn't affect the design. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this tutorial. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I'm really enjoying sharing my knowledge and techniques with you all. Please let me know if there's anything in particular you'd like me to make tutorials on. And this pendant is currently listed in my Shopify, which I will have a link to in the description of this video. Thanks so much for watching.